So let's begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land that we're gathering on. I imagine all over Australia, I think I can see people at least from up and down the East Coast here tonight. We'd love it if you could share the country that you're on in the chat to bring that alive, and also by way of respect and acknowledgement of that country. I'm down here in Naarm, also known as Melbourne, and I'd like to acknowledge the Wurundjeri and Woiwurrung peoples of the Kulin Nation as the traditional custodians of the country that I'm living on and playing on and walking my son, up and down the river on, and it's beautiful country down here. Lots of winding rivers and songs of magpies and cheeky crows. We'd also like to really acknowledge and recognise the continuing connection of the Wurundjeri people to the lands and the waters here, their care for these lands and waters, their protection of these lands and waters, and just how much we have to learn in partnering with and apprenticing to that really deep time cultural knowledge that the elders carry. So really paying our respects was past and present, and extending that respect also to all First Nations people who might be with us today. So I guess I should introduce myself. My name's Beth Hill. I'm the Programs Manager with Psychology for a Safe Climate. And my background is in climate psychology research. I did my PhD looking at the impacts of bushfire on local communities in Australia and how those communities were making sense of bushfire alongside climate change, particularly how they made sense of their vulnerability and responsibility in kind of managing that threat. I'm also trained as a facilitator in the work that reconnects, and these two things sort of weave together in the work that I do with Psychology for a Safe Climate. So I am helping design and develop our programs with many expert volunteers and colleagues here. And PSC works across a number of different fields. We work in the environment and climate space, doing a lot of organisational workshops and support, with lawyers and researchers and scientists and climate campaigners and activists and conservationists, a huge spread of people now really understanding and seeking support with the inner work that's involved in really confronting the climate crisis. And we also do a lot of work in the community as well with our Climate Cafe program, which is a monthly offering at the moment, sometimes a little bit more than monthly, where we bring together people for deep conversation about how they're feeling about the climate crisis. And the last area we work in is offering professional development. And we offer that to lots of different practitioners, so mental health workers, but also facilitators and educators and researchers, anyone really working in the climate field who's wanting to understand a little bit more deeply about the psychological and kind of mental health dimensions of doing that work. And if that interests you, we do have our first professional development offering coming up on Monday. I'll talk more about that at the end. So that's a little bit about PSC. And I'd love to take a moment now to really introduce Susan, which is the reason we're all here. And Susan Murphy is a Zen Roshi, author and freelance radio producer and film director. She is the author of Upside Down Zen, Minding the Earth, Mending the World, and Red Thread Zen, and of course, author of A Fire Runs Through All Things, which is the book that we'll be kind of centering our conversation around this evening. Since 1999, Susan has been teaching and leading Zen retreats in Victoria, Tasmania, and in New South Wales, and is a widely recognised national and international Zen voice whose work has placed special emphasis upon unearthing the ecological heart of the Dharma and the potent resonance of Zen mind with Indigenous sense of country. Perhaps most importantly, from PSC's perspective, we have a long-standing connection with Susan going back to 2015 when she gave a keynote address at one of our first conferences. And it was a really, really beautiful talk that touched me really deeply. And I remember it even now, 9 years later. So thanks for joining us, Susan. It's a real delight to have you here.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Beth. I remember you back then too. It was a really good event, that one. And I should say that I'm speaking here from in Ewan country, which is South Coast 2 hours south of Sydney, just on the edge of Kangaroo Valley, if you know that beautiful place. So, and I'm delighted to be here back with you mob. Seems like a good mob doing good work. So thank you for inviting me, and I'm looking forward to this conversation with my friend Beth.
Too, very much. Well, we might get into it then. I think we're all here. And I've got lots of questions I want to ask. So let's see where it goes. I guess the place I wanted to start, Susan, was something we talk about a lot at PSC is the reality that each person is on their own climate journey over the course of their lives. And sometimes this can explicitly include things like activism or frontline engagement. But a lot of the time, it's a more deeply personal journey of exploration and complex and deep feelings and questions about how to be in these times and what to do. And everyone's journey is unique. And so I'd love to just start by getting a sense of what your climate journey has been so far, significant moments, feelings and questions that you've been living with, and yeah, where you're at now, I guess, in that journey.
I think I'd be shocked if everybody wasn't on some kind of journey with some kind of walking with the fact of, if not a catastrophe, then certainly a very serious crisis that is going to change everything about how we think about ourselves and how we engage. I'm not really sure of the beginning of that for me. It's probably goes all the way back to my childhood and the fact that I had a barefoot childhood until the age of 8. I didn't wear shoes. I think that's a really good start in life because, it sort of means you're in touch with the earth in a very direct way. This was in North Queensland, in Cairns. So that's the place now, sadly, suffering climate change, and especially with the Great Barrier Reef. It breaks my heart even to talk about the Great Barrier Reef because I knew it in its most glorious, utterly, impossibly, it shatters the imagination as it was then. And when I see what's happening with it now, I don't know what to say. I don't know how to live with that except by, first of all, facing it, refusing not to face it, but also to take the grief of that to heart really deeply while not seeing it as something outside of myself. So I think that's been the growing journey of my sort of relationship to this whole matter. Because it has been a Zen, a Zen journey for the last, 45 years or so, that's been a continual kind of questioning of who am I? What is this self? And how is it seamless with? In what way is it not seamless with everything that is around us, everything that we are, everything that we can take in? So that's a very sort of poignant place to come from because you can't help but love the place you are, the place where the earth speaks to you, and it never stops speaking if we are noticing that it is. And that, of course, means we're vulnerable. We can see the precariousness. We can feel that deeply. And it all came to a kind of culmination point, of course, with the fires of 2019, early 2020. That terrible, angry, horrifically long drawn out fire event, not just in New South Wales, of course, but in Victoria and parts of Queensland. But where I am, it was actually coming towards us very, very steadily for around at least 2 months. We could see it coming our way. So that actually had several effects. One of it was to create a very strong community set of bonds between all the people here. A networking took place. We could see, especially the Currowan fire, as it walked its way up the coast and up through the beautiful green spine of New South Wales, south coast. So it got to the Shoalhaven River and we knew that it had a good chance of jumping the river. So this was late 2019, very close to the new year. So we had 3 or 4 weeks of intensive preparation for that, watching with horror what was happening. You'll remember some of those searing images of, I remember one, and I talk about it in the book. It was actually at Malua Bay, about 2 hours south of here. The fire had completely surrounded all the edges of that beach, and all the people of Malua Bay had taken refuge on the beach. It was a really powerful image. There was a white horse standing in the middle of it all, so patiently, so completely kind of present to the fact that all they had in front of them was the ocean, and they were surrounded by fire, and everybody stood there and huddled. It was such an image of where we are in our time. Well, by the time the fire reached us, we had done everything we could do, and we knew we had to evacuate on this particular night very early in January because it had jumped the river and there was a very strong southerly change coming which was going to push the fire into Kangaroo Valley. So I guess the really almost sweet point of that moment was when I decided I've done everything I can. The fire makes you very alert to what has to be done. There's no sort of prevarication, it's so direct. You know what has to be done, and everybody becomes very kind of galvanized and magnetized by each thing that has to be done. It becomes very simple in a way. But it was also, of course, presenting a really huge possibility that as we evacuated that night, we might come back to nothing, to a completely destroyed, ruined, loss. So what I did was, because there's a meditation hall attached to this, where I am, just across the way from this house, I actually set out all the cushions, the meditation cushions in that hall. Sort of brought everybody present who had ever sat there deeply facing themselves, facing reality in the practice of meditation. Made them present and the love they have for the place, because when you sit somewhere deeply, you can't but love and be loved by the place where you are. So having done that, even though that building might burn overnight, I went out and I did something that I'd been taught by Auntie Maureen Smith, a practice of sort of finding the place that wants you to sit down and then just easing your fingertips into the earth very gently, but intently, making that connection, and then saying aloud so that you can hear your own words, "Hello, Mother, I'm here," and you name yourself. "I'm here as your daughter Susan is here." And then you find a question that you must ask that somehow it needs you to know. So I really asked that question, what do you need me? What do you need us to know at this moment? What does it need us to know? Because it was also the sense of the fire has a certain kind of deep intent, a deep significance, a deep presence, almost like a fury, a spirit, yet also something that is deeply related to us. It is our fire. We have unleashed this feral form of fire on the earth. You know, the other kinds of fire, wildfire, has always happened. In fact, the Currowan fire was sparked by lightning, it turns out. And it's smouldered away in southern New South Wales before it really got going for the next couple of months. But there's the other kinds of fire, of course, is the hearth fire, you know, the fire that creates human community, human communion, human storytelling, human cooking and nourishing and warmth. But then there is the fire we have unleashed on the earth by digging up our ancestors actually and burning them. Digging up the fossil fuels of the earth and releasing a form of geological change that is more rapid than anything in the Earth's history up to now. There is, of course, also cultural fire, cultural burning, but we might talk about that later. And so, with that in mind, the sense of the fire almost as a presence with something, with some a deep kind of information to, a deep intelligence of some kind. Looking back at us, you can look into the mirror of that fire and see ourselves. We can see ourselves clearly. We can't not see that. So with that in my heart, I was asking, what does it need us to know? And what do you, Mother Earth, what do you need us to know? And then you kind of wait, and you're waiting in a very particular way, a kind of state of not knowing, not having any kind of preconception. And you wait for some kind of, almost like an answering tingle in your fingers, and words come into you. This has happened to me before. The words arrive somewhere deep in you. And the words that came were this: your suffering with me is my care for you. Your suffering with me is my care for you. And at first glance, that might look almost hard-hearted. How can that be a care for, how can that return? What form of care can that be returning? But I think the really beautiful word in that reply, which is quite Cohen-like in character, the really beautiful word is with. Your suffering with me is my care for you. When you suffer with someone, when you share the suffering, where you move with the stream of suffering in another person, that's compassion. It's called compassion. It is already care. It's already a creative act of caring. And so the fact that we were suffering, it was catastrophic heat warning at that moment. That kind of amazing, formidable new category of heat, of fire warning. It was also raining down leaves, burnt leaves. It had created a huge fire-created cloud so high it was actually dropping rain, just little spots of rain, fire-created rain on us. There was even lightning and thunder coming from that extraordinary cloud, that towering, massive cloud of the Currowan fire coming towards us. So your suffering with me as my care for you has just become a kind of place to settle and really look, how does this work? What kind of relational matter is it making clear? How can we step outside the obvious mutuality of that statement, the way it curves back? Curves back in a way that I found strangely consoling, because it ends with my care for you. It's almost like saying, don't doubt. We belong and we are cared, we are of the earth. We are earth created. How could the earth not care also for each life it ignites? There's a really strong sentient feeling of sentience about even approaching the earth to have a conversation of that kind. It seems to me it's very close to the spirit of country too, which is one continuous conversation if we tune towards it. So that was that's probably the main provocation of the book. What immediately followed, of course, was 2.5 years of COVID. Perfect time to write a book. So naturally the book was titled A Fire Runs Through All Things, which is actually words that were written on a ritual object in a Zen, on an altar in a Zendo, when the very start of my Zen life. And it struck me then, this is a phrase to explore deeply. What is the fire that runs through all things? What is it that makes all things? How are we sharing one rippling, ever-changing fire? Call it fire for the moment and see what comes up for you.
Yeah.
But then, of course, it becomes literal fire when we overheat the earth. And that fire can take the form also of possibly excessive rain. We have destabilized the settings of the planet that made the flourishing of human beings possible. And we have put in motion new settings that are going to be deeply hostile to human life, because our metabolism is formed in ice age conditions. We are prepared for ice ages far more than for the hot planet we are creating. So the journey runs through the question for me of loving, fiercely loving the earth. And I can't think of anything in my life that hasn't been in some way fired by that fact. If I can read you what I put it as an epigraph at the beginning of my book. It's actually the words of Barry Lopez, written very close to his death, actually, from a piece called Love in a Time of Terror. He says, in this moment, is it still possible to face the gathering darkness and say to the physical earth and to all its creatures, including ourselves, fiercely and without embarrassment, I love you, and to embrace fearlessly the burning world? So for me, the journey really is to embrace fearlessly this climate crisis, the burning world, that to my deep regret, I feel we're leaving for the people we love and our children and our grandchildren. So it's a journey of love, really, and of intimacy with the earth herself, with every detail, with the evidence that's utterly always before our eyes of how deeply we belong, and how at the very, I guess you could say, fundamental point, we are seamless with it. And here's where the whole thing about, then why do we feel like we're inside something looking out? And how do we undo that? And what happens when we do undo it? When we do let it dissolve and fall away? So,
I have some questions for you about that.
okay.
Yeah, thank you. Look, there's so much that you've touched on in that, and there's a few pieces I sort of want to draw surface. Sorry, we've just got someone joining us. So just let me pause and take a moment about which thread to choose first. So I think the thread I want to take up first is this message that arose in you, after you put your hands in the earth and asked, what do you want us to know? And it was, your suffering with me is my care for you. Is that right? Just checking I've got it
Yes.
in the right. Yeah. which you're right, is I mean, to me, it does. It sounds just like a koan. It sounds like the sort of phrase you could sit with for a lifetime, and there would be layers and layers of that would keep freshly unfolding. And even as you spoke, actually, what landed for me, which hadn't when I'd read it before, was just the way that when we open to suffering, it also engenders that quality of care, that they travel together in such a seamless way. And so when we turn away from the suffering, there's a way that we're also turning away from that care.
Yeah.
I'd love to just unpick a little more with you. I suppose the role of koans, because so much of that runs through the book in this sort of fierce way, like your love of koans and that practice. And for some people joining us here tonight, they might be quite familiar with koans, and for others, the concept of a koan might be quite foreign. And I'd love to kind of use that kind of earth koan that came through you as a way to perhaps unpack,
Okay.
what
Yep.
is a koan, and why is it so useful to meet the crisis with this quality of presence, with this sort of I guess opening to the unknown and the mystery, when so much of what we're being told all the time is to find certainty and take action and get out there and do things. And I hear you saying something alongside that or underneath that, and I'd love to hear you speak to that.
Okay. Well, first of all, the koan breaks the frame of the way we, in a way, are constantly creating the world, often in the image of our own fear, in fact, or our own sense of uh, impermanence and suffering, impermanence, loss, grief, but particularly fear. Let's stay with fear for a moment, because it was really, I would say I wasn't in a state of fear when I sat down. I was almost in a state of something more like readiness. And that's, you have to approach a koan with empty hands. So a koan, let's take the words of the earth or country or whatever it was that put those words into my heart at that moment. And as I want to say again, I found them to be consoling words. I felt received. I felt met. I felt met. I felt that I had come to meet with open hands and no kind of shield, an unshielded state. What happens then? What can come through then? Well, that's what every koan, in a sense, does. It takes away all the ways we make ourselves up and make the world up. And it turns those around, or it turns them upside down, or it shakes their pockets out to see what else is there. They open only to not knowing. They don't open to any of the things that we bring in or put in front of them. They don't respond to any presupposition. They invite you to step beyond supposing anything at all. Now that seems to me a most valuable thing that a human can do, because otherwise the rest of the time we're simply bringing what we feel we've sorted out about the world and hope to be able to control our circumstances with. And that's a lot of the response to climate change, is about trying to control, trying to come from a place where control is thought to be a distinct possibility. Well, if nothing else, the climate crisis is saying we are not in control. We're certainly not in control of something like the climate or the kind of suffering that we might be heading into and already are heading into as a result of our delinquency, in a way, towards the earth. So every koan places in jeopardy the very idea of the self, the way we've made it up. And every koan opens you beyond that kind of encapsulated self So even look at the way in this, if we take it as a koan, and it's certainly koan-like, you're suffering with me, which was definitely going on at that moment. The earth was suffering, we were suffering, the trees were suffering, billions of creatures had been devoured by the fires that were raging. So you're suffering with me, with all of us in a way, is my care for you. That suffering has value. What is it? How is it? In what ways is it valuable? In what ways is it wising us up? In what ways is it asking us to reconcile with something that we have never formed a real relationship with? It opens up the whole question of relationship with the earth. You're suffering with me. You know, we have a you and me there. We have a relational proposition which doesn't place me first. I'm not first up there. When Beth and I were talking earlier yesterday, I mentioned the beautiful turn that Satish Kumar, really interesting character who carried out remarkable pilgrimages to oppose, or at least to attempt to quell what at that stage was the beginning, the burgeoning of nuclear weapons in the few powers that had nuclear weapons at that time in the 60s. He walked to each of the capitals of nuclear weapon-bearing countries without anything in his pockets, just relying on walking in pilgrimage to be met by everything he needed. And it did for 3 years. That's exactly what he did. But as a child, he was given a beautiful turn of phrase by one of his teachers, which was simply this. That teacher had heard of Descartes' cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am. I'd bracket that say in brackets after that, there it is, how we make ourselves up, how we make up a thing called a self, right there. He turned it around, his teacher turned it around to estis ergo sum, which is you are, therefore I am. And that's a really beautiful turning around of the usual way that we are Westerners, are placed in relationship to the earth. We are placed as if we are a kind of strangely solitary, almost extraterrestrial self, almost as though we can stand somehow aside from the earth that we are. We can't say we're other than the earth. We can't. Not when we look closely. There's not a single part of us that is not earth formed. There's not a single instinct that is not created by endless mutual interrelationship with the living world, this extraordinary reality we're in. So you're suffering with me as my care for you. I can feel how everything moves together in that. I can hear a kind of ecological logic to that statement. I can hear a complete mutuality, almost like you look into the mirror of the earth and you finally see yourself. So this human world, everything moving together, once we have that word with, and in the case of a koan, every single word counts. Every word is a kind of portal. It's a bit like each word contains the whole, brings the whole with it. Like a hologram, like in a hologram, every single, let's not go into holograms. Within every single particle of a hologram, you see the whole is there. So that word with positions you, me, us, not as a victim of circumstances, but as a kind of compassionate companion, compassionate. It's a position of compassion on both sides. The earth is caring for us, the suffering to suffer with the earth. And of course, to care for the earth, you suffer with the earth. We care as much as we love the earth. And the suffering, if nothing else, wakes up the fact, just as every grief does, it wakes up the sense of the full undeniable value and of how precious, how kind of inarguably precious. We finally find that out when we start to see the loss, when we start to lose somebody to death or to a change in circumstances, or to see the changes in the places that you love. I go back to the Great Barrier Reef, except that I almost feel I can't now. I can't go back and see the corpse of the greatest living organism on Earth, which was the place of my awakening as a child. So I think it's that sense of everything moves together, that how can you be a victim when everything moves together? How can we not be a co-creative participant in what is happening? And that's true. That's another way of understanding all the feelings that climate, well, damage, crisis, collapse, catastrophe, used to be called climate change, which was, of course, a kind of weasel word, because, change in climate, that might be quite nice. That was a political move to take the fear and the responsibility away from the fossil fuel corporate world. So I'm not sure where I'm going here, except to say,
I have a thread I'd love to pick up.
okay.
Yeah. I just want to deepen a little around what I feel we're circling around here, which is a really central part of what we work with at PSC all the time. It's what we call climate emotions or earth emotions or ecological emotions. And, the role of emotions and feeling, in doing this work. What does it actually mean to fully open up to, well, as you describe them, these waves that sort of pass through? So rather than viewing emotions as a sort of state of being, a lot of what we do in our workshops is encouraging people to begin to touch into and get to know the shape of what is moving in them, I guess, as a vehicle towards deeper connection with the earth. And I guess I'm hearing a bit of that in what you're saying, but I'm curious to know how you would talk about that, because I'd love to learn and bring that in and kind of marry these ways of speaking about it together.
Well, if we're talking about strong, dark, difficult feelings, obviously, the first move is to turn towards and not away. And so when we do that, it never is what we thought. I mean, this is a commonplace by now, I'm sure, for everybody here, that when you turn towards that which is frightening, it can't remain what it was. For a start, it's starting to be relational because you have turned towards it. I mean, there's a koan that more or less plays with this or brings this to an interesting place. Someone came to an very old teacher, Jiao Zhou, 8th century China teacher, Chan Zen teacher. And they asked him, when difficult times come to visit us, how should we meet them? And Jiao Zhou replied, welcome, welcome. Now, that's not just saying, open yourself towards, greet them as a guest, because difficult times have come to meet you. So already there's a sense of relationship there. If you are looking at in those terms, there's something some kind of offer in that difficult time that's coming to meet you. A little bit like that fire coming to meet us, what did it have to say? How do you find a position of welcome, of openness? Of course, if you are welcoming, you are taking the position of someone who is at home in your circumstances. So it's already a shift onto a ground of that you might have thought you were a victim, but now if you say welcome, you are opening yourself to at least a temporary guest. I mean, you pointed out, Beth, they flow through us. These feelings are dynamic. And I think they invariably have intelligence in them. And finding what that is, first of all, requires not knowing. Not knowing is sort of running as much as Cohen's is running through this book, because you can't approach a koan any way except with unknowing. And not knowing, excuse me, is such a rich skill to develop. A rich sort of habit, or a way of turning towards things with, as I said before, with empty hands, without presuming anything. So another way to understand this form of welcoming with the mind of not knowing, you feel confronted by a strong feeling. Another teacher of that time, Linji, said, whatever confronts you, don't believe it. Let that be your first instinct. Don't believe the apparent knowing that rises up protectively, self-protectively, based on old information, missing what's in front of you. Whatever we approach with a strong sense of knowing, we are screening out almost everything except to find a very small pinpoint of attention. So not knowing, not believing the first thing that confronts you, put that one aside. What's here then? What's here then? It's sort of the mind that doesn't say it is so, but actually turns it into a question. Is it so? What is here? What else is here? What else is here? So when working with emotions is in that way, constantly finds something else under the initial presenting feeling. And that so often turns out to be fear, the most primal sense of, I'm in here, it's out there. It's the stance of separation, of isolation, of alienation, an alienated self. And that is why it's fair to say that the fundamental koan is, what is this self? What is it? What is it that is so apparently first up? First up, when we try to think beyond this sense of self, it's such a strange thing. When we try to actually find this self, it's not there. You cannot find a single, unchanging, substantial self. When you really open yourself to the question of what is this? Who is this? And that, of course, is very much, runs through the practice of Zen. Zen practice is continually daring to ask. Actually, I would say, as an act of love, is daring to ask, what is this self? Who is this? And not who am I, because who am I is already still presuming there's something solid and enduring called I. Now, I'm not dismissing the fact that we have a continual thread of consciousness and memory that is constantly creating a kind of ongoing dream of a self, a rich, interesting dream. I'm not Yeah, I'm fascinated by the dream, in fact. It's rich and interesting and very human. But when you go trying to find a substantial, unwavering, inarguable kind of self, luckily it's not there. There's something much more interesting than any kind of proposition of a self. So, what is this self, and what is it when a strong feeling arises? That's another opportunity to ask or to inquire or to discover, is there an enduring self here? Is there an enduring feeling, even emotion? what kind of what kind of intelligence is this feeling bringing or attempting to bring to the surface? It will almost never be the first, often threatening looking, if it's a dark kind of difficult emotion. It's not going to be what it first presents as. It is never going to, from one moment to another, we're slipping with ease. We don't even notice how well we're doing it from one state to another. So the very coalescence of one feeling into another is beautiful to look into. So there's to take whatever confronts you, don't believe it as a kind of quite, it's almost like a form of paint stripper, It looks like quite a dramatic thing to do. Just don't believe the first thing that comes up when you feel confronted. But try it out. There's a great relief in putting that aside and honestly confessing that you don't know. When you say, I don't know, in the face of a powerful proposition coming from a strong emotion, it leaves you in a very different place. You can do it, in a sense, it's dropping the illusion of control, that we somehow control things. It's letting even strong emotions be a way to smuggle ourselves back into reality, which is what a koan does.
Yeah.
We'd have to can we take up a particular example? Is there something you can think of, Beth, that we could look at together?
In terms of like a particular emotion or a particular instance of something arising in the work that we do, or yeah, could you just clarify what you mean?
Yeah, I suppose I meant a particular kind of emotion because
Hmm. Okay.
obviously, obviously people feel grief, they feel fear, they feel terror, they feel shame, I know I do,
Yeah.
when I look at the legacy that
So
we.
we do this process in a lot of our workshops. It's called a climate emotion word cloud, and
Mhm.
people can enter in via their mobile phones like a whole list of different words that they're feeling, and then it creates a word cloud in real time on a screen. The ones that more people have said get bigger, and so it's this really sort of emergent interactive thing. And lately, what we've noticed is the word helplessness is often one of the biggest words that
Yeah.
emerges. So I'd love to start there maybe. And I'm just tracking as well that we're kind of coming toward the end of you and I just talking. But
Oh,
yeah,
great.
because I think helplessness is a very interesting intersection of a lot of what you've been talking about, because on the
Yes.
surface it
Yes.
sort of is very disempowering, but what actually is underneath that deeper knowing? Yeah.
Well, first of all, I think it is admitting that we've never drawn a non-precarious breath in our lives. We are always in a completely precarious position. We spend a lot of the time smoothing that out into a sense of we have a degree of control over immediate circumstances. We turn the tap off if it's dripping. We can make sure the door is locked. We can, take certain moves to be to feel that we are not helpless, that we have command of our lives enough to be able to feel confident in taking the next step or, making the next move in our lives. But at the same time, as a entire global moment, the most apparent thing probably is this sense of who's in control. What are these forces that are running through the world at a geopolitical level, at a geophysical level? How can I be either protect what I love and save it from damage, or how can I mitigate the harm I can see? How can I be with the grief of feeling that things are falling into a shambles around us, or that that the earth is suffering, that people are suffering, that the helplessness is probably the starting point for agreeing that we have never been in control, and to discover when I think Jem Bendel, who wrote a very interesting paper back in 2017 or 18, Deep Adaptation, where he, as a sustainability expert, finally came to the point where he said, I can't keep up the pretense any longer. I can't say that we are really going to do anything more than smooth little patches of what is going so wrong in such a wrong direction. I am not going to stand pretending that I can any further. And he wrote that paper, Deep Adaptation, in the course of which he actually asked people to really face the question of, or in a way, the reality that great damage is inevitable, that catastrophe is probable, and even that extinction of our species in this is actually possible. Now, those are huge propositions. And instead of this flattening the people who he presented this to, because he got people into a group to really take this in, a whole number of small groups. They faced it together, they examined these propositions together, and to his astonishment, they didn't flatten, they didn't fall into apathy or depression or despair. They found themselves energized by the fact that they had faced them together. They had met them in relationship with each other, effectively a loving relationship, because they're agreeing to be helpless and vulnerable in the face of these huge propositions that we must face. And he found they felt lighter, more creative, more energized. They had a sense of, I would say, just the fact of looking together with people you trust or with whom trust opens up because you are looking together. The sense of helplessness becomes difficult to find. It is not the first arising matter at all. And in fact, I talk in the preface to this book about a moment back in my life when I was 12 years old. And my brother and sister and I spent one night after dinner, we just stayed on at the table talking. And we started to talk about the world. We started to talk about it as it was then, the sense of overpopulation, of the obvious first signs of environmental damage and the beginning of the extinction cataclysm that we're in, where the rate of extinctions was beginning. There were dark signs right back then. And as children, we were still, teenagers, young teenagers, we took this in together very close family, very close to my brother and sister. And we're looking at this together. It was huge. It was sort of overwhelming at a certain level. And I remember going to bed that night feeling two things. One was as though I was carrying the shards of almost unbearable feelings and possibilities with me. I also felt bigger because I think it was the first sign of, or the first feeling of taking on something of the adult weight of the world, caring deeply. We all felt ourselves caring very deeply. And I woke up in the morning, sat down at the same place we had talked way into the night until 3 o'clock in the morning or so. And when I pulled in my chair and put my hands on the table and had a bowl of cereal in front of me, I remember it really clearly. A huge wave came over me of complete, what can I describe it? A sense of how complete and beyond praise, how all things were deeply well, even while and even in the face of or alongside facing how dangerous and how difficult and how all things were so wrong at a certain level. But the underlying feeling, this great wave went through me of kind of joy, of a joy that there's something more fundamental that can only be reached through facing the helplessness, not even just facing it, but feeling it completely, taking it deeply in. Now, this was a childhood experience, on the edge of childhood anyway. But it was such a kind of deep sort of a reassurance of some kind that there is an elemental connection that we can touch into, tap into, draw on and share, and that it is bigger and unpredictable, and you can't magic it up, but it is there at the base if you can really open yourself and hold nothing back and do it in the company of others. And I come back to the word love, it's a kind of fearless love to do it together, to dare to look together at what is so threatening. Helplessness otherwise is I have to do something, I have to protect myself, I must overcome, it is that little kind of alienated sense of self that is that we must see through and break out of and rejoin. Well, we've never left. It's never left us. We just turned our back on it. So it's very strongly a matter of agreeing to be with what is, to being with it without a shield of self, without a sense, with a certain fearlessness that comes. Fearlessness really arrives when the exigency is strong enough, and courage is only discovered through fear. The courage is born by facing the fear.
Yeah.
So you can't take the medicine away from the sickness. You can't take you can't take the poison away from, Novalis, the German poet Novalis said, where the danger grows also that which saves. So in the danger is the salvation, or the salvific energy. In the strong, dark feeling is the salvific turning, What I talk about in the book is how koan-like emotions are, in fact, how much they can be turned around, find a totally different face than the one that first presents.
Yes,
And
I think especially when you learn to let them move the way they move without assuming or presuming what they are, as
yep,
you don't know where it's going to end and where it's going to take you. And so much of what I've observed in doing this work with people over so many years is just as you say, the emotions become a portal. Despair, fully felt right down through to the bottom, often becomes a portal towards hope in a way that you cannot intellectually explain to someone. You just have to experience it. And I'm hearing that in a lot of what you're saying as well. I'm
I,
also just really cautious. I'd love to just give you some time to close, but just I really would love to give people some time to ask you questions as well before we close up the whole call. Is there anything you'd like to end with before we open up to other questions?
well, there's so many things that we thought we were going to get to.
Please.
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, look, maybe I can read, can I just read a couple of things? One of them I think helps to understand this sense of not knowing and while in the midst of what we're in the midst of, which is a rapidly changing, unpredictable, it will never come to an end. That's another thing to rely on, actually. Nothing ever comes to an end. There's nothing called an end in impermanence. There's nothing. Nothing will ever complete in that sense. But one thing that I came across once was I heard an expert of whitewater rafting, whitewater canoeing, talking about the various classifications of rivers. And he was describing in particular a class 5 river. And I found this to be such an interesting analogy for a lot of what we've been talking about whenever we're talking about the fact, the inarguable fact of climate crisis. So I'll just read a little. A class 1 river, you can go canoeing, no problem. A class 6 river, don't even think about it. And a class 5 river, okay, the only way you can go down that river is if you're confident you know how to find and follow the through line. And you can map this onto difficult, wild emotions as well. You find the through line, the safest way through the rapids. The through line is not an outcome. It's the way through and with a constantly changing flow. The world is in a class 5 river now, wouldn't you say? Savage rocks ahead on either side of us that could destroy our fragile boat. Fierce whirlpools that can swallow us whole. As with country, we must learn to read conditions beyond the noise of there's a rock that will shred our boat, or that whirlpool will plunge us headfirst. Our fragile boat will be sucked under. So to find the subtle through line in a class 5 river, you must be able to read all the small telling details. If you miss them, they can spin you towards the big dangers. It's crucial, our whitewater expert said, not ever to fix attention on the truly big obstacles and dangers, because they will magnetize your attention and draw your fear to only them. And that way you miss the subtle, salvific through line, discovered only when you stay fully aware of the entire river, the entire sort of field of awareness of what is in play in difficult emotions or, you know, the frightening facts that we live with every day, that we swim in. So you can't map anything out in advance. You can't work your response out in advance of discerning moment by moment what is immediately in front, what is happening right where we are. And so this is, in a way, it's like taking refuge in the wildness of the river as well, or the wildness, the difficulty of the feeling. And so, most important of all, he also said, notice, or actually, when looking for the through line, you are looking for it in concert with all the people in the boat. So this for me is the real arrival point of what I was talking about a moment before, that sense of that it is all the many eyes and hands needed to find and stay in accord with the flow. A class 5 river, let's call it climate crisis, if you like, is not an object to be fought or conquered in an act of personal heroism. There is a relief in letting go the mind of being in militant opposition to reality, and instead seeking to navigate the subtlety of its flow. So it's the same in activism and collective action of any kind, that is to propose a single powerful enemy that must be overcome. That is to resource and strengthen and rivet all eyes on one, missing the perspective of the emergent field of circumstances. So that's part of, that's a reasonable summation of some of the things we've been talking about today. And that sense of that runs through all of it, that keenly noticing and not presuming, that fine-grained noticing is very different from knowing. In fact, it's the very opposite. To notice something is to be right on the edge of our senses, right on the edge of not knowing. We actually can't see something as simple as even a stone or a twig or a small bush or another person, as long as we are knowing in advance, in a sense that is to actually lose, to be outside the moment of the encounter and to fail even to be in a position to see the unrepeatable nature of what is presenting just for this rare and fleeting moment. Because the fire that runs through all things, apart from emptiness itself, is impermanence. It's also the fact that nothing, the lucky chance of every moment is that nothing is permanent, nothing stays the same. One thing is always becoming another. So to be with that flow, to be noticing it in a fine-grained way, that's the great offer of a moment like the one we're in, a dangerous, perilous, precarious, deeply interesting moment that I think is here to actually awaken quite a different maturity of being human. You'll have to read the book to hear the rest. I can't. But I'd
Indeed.
love to hear,
It's a beautiful book, Susan, and I've read it twice now, once just for the joy of it, and then again in preparation of this conversation. And I think I'll have to read it a third time as well. There's so many beautiful moments that you draw out throughout it that raise many questions and leave us in that exact not knowing mind that is so powerful and beautiful. So thank you. Yeah.